We're extremely grateful for the partnership that we have with the First, and we could not host this annual event without them. Also, we want to thank everyone for your flexibility with this year's event because it's being conducted virtually due to the pandemic. I know we would all rather gather in person, but we're optimistic that those times are in our near future again. So before we begin the program, I'd like to offer a little housekeeping information to help things move smoothly. We have two outstanding presentations today. To ensure that both speakers have ample time to make their presentations, we ask that you hold all questions until the end. And at that point, we'll have a Q&A session. If you have questions during the presentations, please use the Q&A feature on your screen and select to address all of the panelists. After both presentations are complete, I will read each submitted question aloud for both presenters to answer. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rodney D. Bennett, the 10th President of the University of Southern Mississippi, who will now make opening remarks.
Dr. Beckett, thank you, and good morning to each of you. I'd like to begin by saying how happy I am that each of you could join us for the University of Southern Mississippi's 2021 Economic Outlook Forum. Like Dean Beckton, I too would like to thank our title sponsor, the First, a National Banking Association, for their ongoing partnership in presenting this event and for their support of the university as a whole. I'd like to extend a very special welcome to our guest presenters, Mr. Paul Benda and Mr. Peter Bertucci. Thank you both for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today, and we look forward to your insights. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge each of you who have joined us for this virtual event. Although our current circumstances prevent us from being together in person, I'm excited that this virtual format is allowing us to welcome new guests from across the Southeast, including Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. Regardless of whether you are joining us for the first time or you have been in attendance for each and every past Economic Outlook Forum, I appreciate your engagement. Your participation today demonstrates your commitment to advancing our economy for the betterment of us all. And the University of Southern Mississippi is proud to be your partner in this very important work. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the university, and even for those of you who have visited our campuses many times in the past, but have not been able to do so in the last year, I'd like to share a few images this morning to provide a sense of place as we discuss several of the university's current initiatives in support of economic development. The University of Southern Mississippi was founded in 1910, and since that time, we have grown to become a comprehensive public research institution delivering transformative programs on campuses in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Long Beach, Mississippi, and teaching and research sites across the Mississippi Gulf Coast and through online programs. Our robust research enterprise extends from the depths of the Gulf of Mexico to the heights of the International Space Station. The University of Southern Mississippi is one of only 131 institutions in the nation to earn the Carnegie Foundation's top R1 doctoral universities, very high research activity designation, which places us among some of our nation's most prestigious and elite institutions like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins. Since our inception in 1910, USM has remained deeply rooted in the communities we serve, generating an annual economic impact of more than $600 million across the state of Mississippi. We are pleased to be a primary partner in our state's economy as we work to provide high-quality education and research programs to our next generation of leaders. And our economic impact is much broader than just educating our workforce. The University of Southern Mississippi is led by a vision of becoming the model for public higher education across our country. Our ability to bolster economic and community partnerships is certainly a critical component of our success. And I'm proud that we make vital contributions to economic development in Greater Hattiesburg, along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, throughout the state of Mississippi, and far beyond our borders. I am also very proud of the expert faculty who are leading our College of Business and Economic Development in demonstrating excellence through national rankings and preparing our graduates for critical leadership roles in the workplace. I am also proud of our institutional commitment to supporting military students and families. With a gold status designation, the University of Southern Mississippi is the top military-friendly four-year institution in the state of Mississippi. We recently broke ground on Quinlan Hammond Hall of Honor, which will house the University Center for Military Veterans, Service Members, and Families. And I cannot wait to see how this transformative facility further supports our work to give back to the men and women who have sacrificed so much for our freedoms. I know many people on the call this morning have a deep appreciation for the Gulf Coast. Whether your home state borders the Gulf, or whether you have traveled to destinations along the coast for work or vacation. The east-west continuum from Texas to the Florida Panhandle represents a region that means so much to so many people and to the University of Southern Mississippi. While I won't have the time this morning to elaborate on all of the university's exciting initiatives on the coast, I do want to highlight our work with respect to two key areas. First, the university is fortunate to have rich partnerships with many state and federal partners through our extensive coastal research enterprise, including the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, more commonly referred to as NOAA, and the United States Navy. We are focused on further developing these partnerships to advance the education, the research, and the economic needs along the coast. And I hope we will soon be able to announce a specific set of new initiatives in this regard. And then secondly, the university recently appointed Dr. Shannon Campbell as our new Senior Associate Vice President for Coastal Operations. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Campbell, as she has spent the last 8 years leading the university's Trent Lott National Center for Excellence in Economic Development and Entrepreneurship. I am so excited that Dr. Campbell has agreed to chart a new path forward for the university's operations all along the coast, focused on 3 foundational pillars. Those pillars are understanding the ocean and the coast, improving coastal resilience, and supporting the blue economy. The university is in the process of launching a national search for a new director of our Trent Lott National Center. And I'm confident that we will have a high level of interest in the position due to the good work that Dr. Campbell has done to establish that center as the leading economic development resource of our region. And I'll pause for a moment to say, if you know of people who would be good to serve as the director of that center, I encourage you to ask them to apply once that position is posted on our website. As you can see, the university is deeply involved in a wide range of activities that support and cultivate economic potential. And we look forward to our ongoing partnership with each of you as we continue investing in our communities, as we continue investing in our state, and as we continue investing in our region. Just as the university's future is bright, so is the future of the great state of Mississippi. In closing, I would like to again thank each of you for your commitment to this work as we continue charting new paths together. It is now my pleasure to introduce a dynamic leader of our company, the First, the National Banking Association, and a dynamic leader of the Hattiesburg community, a devoted husband, and a very loving father, Mr. Hoppy Cole, who is president and CEO of our title sponsor, the First, a National Banking Association. Hoppy, did I do that introduction the way that you paid me? I'm sorry, the way that you asked me to do it?
Yes, Chandra is making a deposit in your account today, Dr. Bennett.
Thank you, thank you.
On behalf, thank you, Dr. Bennett, for those warm and gracious accolades. On behalf of the First, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you attending today, our 12th Annual Economic Forum. Gosh, it seems like just yesterday that we started this event, and it's grown each and every year, and it's really been an exciting time for us. Today, as has been pointed out, is our first virtual conference. We normally host this on the campus of USM. It's a great time for fellowship and for folks around our footprint to get together and visit. We'll look forward, hopefully, to doing that again next year. But we're also very excited about the virtual component because as has been pointed out by Dr. Bennett, the virtual aspect of this is going to allow us to greatly expand our reach, not only across the Southeast, but potentially nationally. So we're very excited about the virtual feature and what that means to us. We appreciate our partnership with the University of Southern Mississippi. Dean Beckton, as always, thanks so much for you and your staff making this program such a success. I know you guys have put a lot of hard work into it. We appreciate working with you guys throughout the year and all that you do for us. Dr. Bennett, let me also say, and I know I speak on behalf of the First, but also on many of the participants here today, thanks so much for your leadership during this very difficult time. The university is obviously a very important economic driver, very important that it be successful to us, for everyone here on the call. And your leadership navigating the university through very difficult time, continuing to make it such a success, we appreciate that. So I want you to know we very much are grateful for that.
Thank you, Hoppy.
And finally, thanks to Jennifer Trussell and our in-house marketing department. Again, you guys have made this or will make this a very great success, and thanks for all the extra effort that you put forth. I'd like to talk just a minute about the bank and kind of a little bit about who we are. Our company was founded in 1996 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Many of the original founders of our bank still serve on our board today. We are a publicly held company. We trade under the symbol FBMS on NASDAQ. About 50% of our company is owned by institutional investors, professional money managers that help support and have helped support our growth over the years. And we have a market capitalization today of just over $700 million. I can tell you, on behalf of the board and the original investors in the bank, we have been blessed beyond what we could have ever imagined. We have grown our company into a regional franchise, a highly profitable, high-performing regional franchise, and we currently serve a 5-state area with 84 locations and approximately 800 team members in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We currently have over $5.2 billion in assets, and I can tell you we could have never dreamed that. That makes us the 5th largest bank headquartered in the state of Mississippi. And one thing that we are particularly proud of is that we are the largest community development financial institution in the country. That is a special designation by the U.S. Treasury for financial institutions that have a mission and serve underserved markets, particularly markets that are defined as moderate income and low to moderate income markets. As you know, any financial institution, particularly any bank, generally reflects the health of the markets and the economies that it serves. So for over 10 years, we've had as a primary mission of our company to reach out and make sure that those markets, that we invest in those markets and we provide opportunities for growth, which again helps us and our company continue to flourish. We think we're an excellent example of a private-public partnership, again, in working with the U.S. Treasury to make sure that those markets continue to grow and prosper as we move along. I know today on our conference, there are a number of our advisory directors attending across our 5-state area. I want to say thank you on behalf of the board of directors, the shareholders, the team members, for joining our company and helping to serve. They are critical in furtherance of our community development financial institution designation and furtherance of our mission across our footprint. So thank you all for that. And finally, we are extremely excited today about our program. We've got two very good speakers. We have Paul Benda, who is with the American Bankers Association. I think you're going to very much enjoy his program. He is our resident pandemic expert. He'll give you some really good numbers in regards to what's going on with that. And then secondly, we have Dr. Peter Raschuti, who's been a longtime supporter and friend of our bank. We have participated in his Burken Roads program over many years. And I told Dr. Raschuti that, in fact, tomorrow, one of my favorite times of the year is a group of his students come annually. And this year we'll have to do it virtually, but they come annually. And they sit around and they ask our CFO, Dee Dee Lowry, and myself a lot of questions in order to do their research report about our company. But one of the things we always do is, as those of you in the college students, hey, you can almost get anything out of them for food. So we usually have lunch brought in to keep them around a little longer, because then Dee Dee and I get to ask some questions of some very bright 20-somethings with diverse backgrounds, some international students and folks from all over the country. And so it keeps me up to date on how they think about things. So again, Peter, thanks for your support, and I'll enjoy that tomorrow, even though it'll be virtually. So I think my last job here is to introduce our first speaker, Paul Benda. And Paul joined the American Bankers Association in 2018, where he leads the association's initiative in cybersecurity, physical security, and information security practice. He chairs the ABA fraud coordination group. He acts as the media spokesman for the American Bankers Association and the banking industry on these issues. He helps coordinate ABA's response to the coronavirus pandemic and has done an outstanding job in helping us, and I know his member banks, navigate all the issues presented by that. His past experience includes leadership positions in the Department of Homeland Security, where he was head of research and development in the Department of Defense, where he was a DARPA program manager and designated security systems and designed security systems for the Pentagon. Paul started his career as an active duty U.S. Air Force officer and transitioned to the private sector, where he worked as a consultant for Booz Allen before returning to government. So Paul, thank you today for being here, and we'll look forward to your presentation, sir.
Great, thanks, Hoppy. So I'm going to give a presentation here, and Hoppy, I appreciate the opportunity. Dr. Beckton and Dr. Bennett, thank you so much. So I know that several of our attendees might be wondering, why is a banker guy giving me a presentation on COVID? But first I want to say, I'm not a professional. Although I did stay at a Holiday Inn last night. I guess no one's doing that anymore. But please just look at the disclaimer and follow that. But what I want to talk about today is the virus and the vaccine and where we're going. And so why are you going to listen to a banker or an ABA guy talk about that? So Hoppy did mention I was a DARPA program manager, and when I was there, I actually was in charge of designing sensors to detect chemical and biological attacks. I led the response of the Pentagon to the suspected anthrax attacks and ended up running all the security at the Pentagon, which meant I oversee our CBRN teams, which was hazmat, the on-site laboratory, all the sampling that took place, and development of technical systems to defend against a chem bio attack. So I had an operational role, I then went to Homeland Security, where I was the head of HSARPA. So I ran that R&D organization and worked with the Secret Service, worked with what then was the precursor to CISA, the Cyber and Information Security or Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And then went back to the private sector and ended up at ABA. So it turns out there's not many bankers that have a chem bio background. And so as the pandemic raised in concern and impacted the country, I started taking over a leadership position with ABA. And now generally I'm the point for the financial sector for it. So I brief an interagency group on a weekly basis. That includes all of our prudential regulators, as well as several of our government colleagues in terms of where we stand with the pandemic and trying to predict the impact to our sector, as well as when we think we'll return to normal. So we're going to focus on that today. It's not an economics brief, but as everyone knows, the pandemic has probably had the most impact on our economy than anything in recent memory. And so when we can actually start getting back to normal is a critical question that we're going to try and address today. So we're going to focus on where we stand in terms of the virus, the different strains that are out there, what's driving that transmission. We're going to look at the vaccines that are out there, the different versions, how it affects transmissivity of the virus. If I'm vaccinated, can I still get someone else sick? How those vaccines have been prioritized and distributed, and then some of the changes that we've seen, some of the really, really, really good changes in terms of production rates and distribution rates. And in the end, what does that new normal look like for us? So this chart was just updated yesterday. That graph that you see there comes from the CDC. Anyone can go to there and look at different ways the CDC presents data. Really good news is we've had a huge drop since that big peak that we had in January. They've plateaued a little bit, but they're actually starting to come back down again. You might be able to see that very end point is coming down again. And so that's hopefully good news. One of the reasons we think that this drop occurred, and you don't hear a lot about this in the press, is there's a huge number of Americans that have already been infected. So that box in the upper right-hand corner is actually from the CDC. They estimated how many people have already contracted the coronavirus. So the CDC does this regularly for the flu. They've got really good processes and policies in place that allow them to estimate, infections of diseases. And this was back on January 15th. They had estimated 83 million. Well, if you extrapolate that out to where we are today, that means there's about 96 million adults that have been infected with the coronavirus. And now if you take that as a percentage of population over 16, and I use that number because that's our vaccinatable population. We can't vaccinate people under 16 right now. So our vaccinatable population is around 266 million. So of that vaccinatable population, around 36% have already contracted the coronavirus and have what we call acquired immunity. There's a big question on, people ask, how can I get reinfected if I've already got it? Reinfections are still relatively rare. In the vast majority of cases, you don't get reinfected. We're not sure how long that immunity lasts. There's been multiple studies that have come out that it's 6, 7, 8, 9 months, and that's simply because the coronavirus hasn't been around that long, so we're not sure how long it lasts. But we know it's pretty strong, and we know it's pretty solid. So that's how many people have acquired immunity, about 96 million Americans. We're also accelerating our vaccine distribution rates. About 44 million Americans have received their first dose around 2 weeks ago. Why I picked 2 weeks ago? Well, at that point, that's when the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines really start to kick in with some level of protections for you. The effectiveness can be anywhere from 60 to 70% by that time period. So we've got 96 million, 44 million that have achieved vaccinated immunity. Let's say there's some overlap in there. Let's say some of those people that have been vaccinated were had already been infected. Let's say a third of those. So if we add those numbers together, it turns out about 125 million Americans have some level of immunity to the coronavirus. That is a huge number. It's almost 50% of the population that's out there. So we think this is a driver for where we're at in terms of a drop of the diseases. People talk about seasonality and other things. It's still cold now. Is it cold back then? It's really not a driver there. We think this is really a big driver of it. The big question comes is as these different strains come into play, how is that going to change our infection rates? The prevalent strain was called the D614G, and I'm going to throw a lot of numbers and names out there for you for these different strains. But that was really the prevalent strain. We know that reinfection is very rare for those. And we know the B117 strain, the UK strain that you might have heard a lot about that's really transmissive is out there, but it doesn't reinfect. The fear is, though, there's other variants of concern out there, one from Brazil, one from South Africa, and we're not sure how that's going to affect reinfection rates. If they're not as bad as we fear, we hopefully will see this trend continue to go downward. So we talked about those different strains. There's the virus mutates, all viruses mutate. We've got the New York strain, we've got the California strain, people talk about the Colorado strain. The challenge we've got is that the US, up until recently, has not invested in doing the strain tracking. So the US was less than 1% of our samples were sampled. You look at a place like the UK, it's like 10%. You look at Denmark, they're almost at 50%. They have a much better idea of how the virus is mutating than we have. Now we're making strong investments now, but we're not necessarily sure how prevalent these strains are in the US. The one that's obviously the most common is the B117 strain. So of the strains that we have sampled, there's about 2,000 or so that have been identified. The B117 is the vast majority. It's around 95% or more of those strains. This is the one that's taken over Europe. It's the UK strain. It's endemic within the UK. The concern is that it's highly transmissive, about 50 to 75% transmissive. But the good news is vaccines are effective against it. There's been no drop in efficacy that we've seen in the vaccines. There was some fear that maybe it had a higher case mortality rate. There was a meta study that was done that examined 10 to 12 different studies, examined 12 studies. 10 of those showed some level of increased mortality rates, but the data was kind of all over the map. And so the jury is still out whether that strain has a significantly higher case mortality rate. So it's to be concerned about, to be tracked, but it's not really that as big of a concern as the other strains that are out there, the B1351 and the P1 strain. These have what's called the E484K mutation. This mutation is concerning because it's a mutation around the area that all of our vaccines targeted, that receptor binding domain. And that's why when you hear the studies that the antibodies don't seem to be as efficacious or as neutralizing, it's because the virus has changed and they don't bind as well. And so that's our concern is, how well are our vaccines going to work with this mutation that's in place? And the other thing is that acquired immunity you still have those antibodies, they still stop that binding, but it's less effective. And so we've seen reinfections that occur. There's a big splash that was made with this California strain that came out last week. Oh, it's terrible, it's worse than these other, the Brazilian or the South African one. The data's really out on that in terms of how bad that strain is. It was a article focused on a pre-published preprint. And so really it didn't have the scrutiny that it needed to have to make the conclusions it was. What I want to do is step back though and talk about, we're still highly transmissive. We're still seeing, 55, 60,000 cases a day, potentially could go up. So there's still risk out there for that virus transmission. One of the things that I think is really interesting though is we've seen multiple data sets that the kids in schools, if done appropriately, aren't drivers of transmission. There's multiple studies out there. I bring up this Duke UNC one because I thought it was a really good example. 100,000 students and staff tracked for over 9 weeks. There were only 32 cases of in-school transmission. Now, they followed good public health guidance. They had mask, social distancing in place, but there was no cases of a child infecting an adult. So I think there's a clear push, especially for the younger kids, to get them back in school. And with the appropriate public health measuring, we expect to see not a significant rise in cases. Really, it's the community transmission that drives it. The movie I've got running there shows kind of how the viral particles spread. You've got two different colors there. You've got blue, which are aerosolized particles, and then you've got the larger red particles that actually deposit relatively quickly. Those red particles are really driven, cause that 6-foot distance. We want people not to be infected by the larger particles because they carry more virus particles. That's why people stay 6 feet away. The thing is, early on, we didn't recognize those blue particles also carry the virus. And then when you put them in a room where there's HVAC flows and different spreads, they move around. And this is what we see in restaurants and other places where people aren't masked, they're expelling this virus. Now, the big challenge we've got with this is that we don't know who expels this virus or how much. There was a great study that came out of India. There was a follow-on study that came out of China that actually confirmed these results. But they did contact tracing of 575,000 people. And the really scary thing they found was that 8% of people were responsible for 60% of the transmissions. There's 10% of people, 1 in 10 people are super spreaders. If you're in the room with them at the wrong place at the wrong time and they're not wearing a mask, you're going to get infected because they just expel so much virus and we know it can spread around a room. The good news is there's 70% that weren't linked to any infections. So the majority of people actually don't spread the virus. I think this caused a lot of confusion, especially in the early times. And even now, oh, I know someone, it's not that bad. A friend of mine, his wife had it, but he didn't catch it. Well, that's because he was lucky. She was one of the 70% that didn't spread it. If it happened to one of those people, know, there's a case in South Korea, they've got really good contact tracing, so they can track these a little better, where, you know, there was people overlapped in a restaurant for 5 to 10 minutes and they got sick. And that's because that one person was very likely a super spreader and was just expelling so much virus. So that's the challenge we have going forward is, and it's really the driver of why people wear masks, is that you're not sure who's going to be that super spreader. And so the question is, you know, do masks work? I think the vast majority of Americans believe they do. There's a great chart here. There's a big difference in masks, though. You know, the one thing I would say in here, face shields are frankly completely ineffective. They don't do anything. You can look at the data here. If there's really not much difference in terms of restricting particle concentrations that you would receive. So I'm not a big fan of face shields. Cloth masks are helpful. N95 masks are the best. And so what I would suggest is, you know, what I actually wear is an N95 mask with a vent, and I put a second mask over it. You can see here the difference in the different types of masks that are out there. So no mask, cloth mask with 2 layers, and surgical mask. You know, the key for masking is not necessarily to protect yourself, it's to protect others. And you can see stopping the large particles, which is the big driver of transmission, especially when you're close, is really helpful for these masks. But they also stop the spread of particles when it comes into that aerosolized transmission. So that's the big thing. You know, wearing those masks, you know, if you wear a good mask, you can protect yourself as well. And there's a lot of mask availability out there. I highly recommend, even if you're vaccinated, to get that mask and put that on. Because then, you know, what you're doing is there's some people that aren't vaccinated, and we can show that vaccines actually don't necessarily stop you from getting disease, and you still might transmit it. So, you know, how do I travel and eat out safely? I just put this in there because there still is virus out there. There's still variants of concern that people can get affected with. Until you're vaccinated, you really need to make sure that you're taking the appropriate precautions. You know, I'm not a big fan of surface contamination. There's yet to be any significant studies that show that surface contamination transference risk is high. Frankly, I've stopped, you know, I wash my hands, that's about it. I don't worry about groceries. You might remember the YouTube doctor back that he had the sterile spot and the unsterile spot and all these different things of, you know, doing his groceries when he came home. Really way overkill at this point. And so when you look at driving, it's really low risk. You know, the gas pump isn't going to be anything. You're going to be in that convenience store for a short time. You're coming back out, you know, just make sure you're wearing your mask when you're in there. When you look at flying, flying is relatively low risk. You know, remember when you're in an airplane, you've got that HEPA filtered air that's coming over you. When you fly, it's important though to take the appropriate precautions because remember, if you happen to be next to that one person who's that super spreader, you're going to catch that virus even in that enclosed space, even if they only wear their mask while they're eating their peanuts. So what I'd suggest, sit in that window seat, turn on that vent fan above you, that's clean HEPA air, have it wash over you continuously. If you're going to eat or drink after everyone else is done eating or drinking, and really, you know, restrict the amount of time that you have that mask down around your face. And then lastly, restaurants, I would not eat inside a restaurant. That's just too high of a risk. You just don't know who's going to be there, who's a super spreader. You just have no idea. A lot of restaurants don't necessarily have upgraded HVAC systems. They're not necessarily filtering the air. If you want to eat at a restaurant, you know, finally spring is approaching, eat outside. If you're vaccinated, I will eat in a restaurant. I haven't gotten my vaccine yet. I have my appointment for next week, which I'm very excited about. But once I'm vaccinated, once I've gotten my second shot, or if I get the J&J after 28 days, I will eat in a restaurant. But until that point, to me, the risk is simply too high as we go forward. So I put this slide up here. I am not a medical doctor. I'm not an expert in vaccines, but I think it's important to level set of what these vaccines were developed for. There's 2 different kinds of vaccines. You know, there's sterilizing immunity, which means it stops the disease in its track. You don't get the disease. You know, the HPV vaccine is a great example of this. You don't get the disease, you can't transmit it to anyone. That is not how our coronavirus vaccines were evaluated. They're evaluated for effective immunity. So to prevent severe disease, you can still catch the coronavirus with our vaccines. You know, one of the things that people don't realize, they didn't formally track asymptomatic infections for any of these vaccine developments. They didn't track whether the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine stopped you from being infected. They tracked the level of disease that you had. And in fact, the Moderna vaccine, when they actually did take samples, you know, samples of people prior to getting their second shot, showed the vaccine was only 61% effective against asymptomatic infection. So that's key to remember. It doesn't stop you from getting sick. It stops you from feeling sick or getting moderate or severe forms of COVID. The other thing to remember is, you know, we talk about, you know, the antibodies aren't necessarily as neutralizing for those new strains. That's one leg of that 3-legged stool that your immune system has. You've got antibodies, you've got B cells, and you've got T cells. So those B cells and T cells remain in your body. And there's even studies that show that they can evolve over time, that they've seen people who've had B cells and over 6 months have actually evolved and think that they might actually be able to defend against those strains even a little better as they get exposed to them. So there is some hope. It's not all doom and gloom that the antibodies are less effective at neutralizing it. There are other parts that our bodies use to respond to that, to those diseases. And the other thing, none of these vaccines can cause COVID. None of them use live or even inactivated coronavirus. They use modified parts of it. So that's one thing from a safety perspective people should keep in mind. So the vaccines that we've got out there is the Pfizer, Moderna. It is truly an astounding achievement, never done in human history, to develop a vaccine so quickly and one that is so effective right out of the gate. It is, I hope it heralds a new era for us in vaccination. And I was really excited. There's a new malarial vaccine that uses some similar technology, actually the next generation of mRNA technology that could be effective, which would be, malaria kills 1.5 million people a year. If we could knock that out, it would just be amazing. So these are new technologies, never been approved vaccine using these technologies before, but they didn't cut corners in terms of how they were studied. As I was putting this presentation together, I looked at, what were the size of the trials for previously approved vaccines. So we had an Ebola vaccine, HPV vaccine, other vaccines. Generally, those trials went from 15,000 to 30,000 participants, a lower level. The Pfizer vaccine, 44,000, Moderna, 30,000, J&J, 44,000, Novavax, 38,000. These were big trials. They did not cut corners in these trials and significantly reviewed. The FDA is requiring 2 months of safety data after completion of the trial. So this is, I am very comfortable in terms of the oversight that we've had in place for these vaccines. And the Pfizer Moderna vaccine have been amazing in their efficacy. Now remember, these were checked earlier. They were mostly focused on that original strain, the D614G strain that was prevalent, and maybe been exposed a little bit to the B117 strain, but they weren't really tested against the B1351 or the P1 strain, those variants of concern that we're really worried about now. And so we look at that 95%. You got to remember, you can't necessarily compare that directly to the J&J efficacy because it wasn't tested against the same strains. It still does a great job, and we're actually showing that it's working in real world. There was a great Israeli study. Israel is ahead of everyone else in terms of the vaccination. They used the Pfizer vaccine, and the great news is they showed it was 90% effective against asymptomatic infection 7 days after that second dose. So it not only protects you, but it protects those around you. For Moderna, we expect it to be very similar. Like I said, there was that study where they took swabs prior to the second dose, so before you got that second dose, and it was around 62% effective. So we show that it is decreasing asymptomatic infection. But again, they weren't tested against those variants of concern. They are doing studies for children. So Pfizer's already completed their 12 to 15-year-old study or has finished enrollment. They expect to have those results sometime in June. They've got a second study for younger kids, but not likely that we'll see any of those approved for younger kids before next year. The teenagers, likely before the start of the school year. Moderna's completed theirs as well. And so hopefully we'll start seeing those answers and maybe get those middle school and high schoolers who are more susceptible, who are more likely to be transmitters of that virus, get those vaccines part of the start of next school year. J&J is a third vaccine that's been approved. It uses a more traditional method, the adenovirus vector, to insert the DNA, and that's why its DNA is more robust, can actually be handled a little easier than the Pfizer Moderna vaccines. And it was an international trial, 19,000 from the US, South America, and South Africa. So when we look at the overall effectiveness of 66%, it doesn't sound that great, but you can see there's a big range, 72% in the US and 57% in South Africa. So I guarantee you, if we'd had Pfizer Moderna that had the same spread, they wouldn't be at that 95%. They might be at 85%, 90%, 80%. We don't know, but it's not necessarily going to be as high as it was before. So the big thing to remember about J&J is that it stops severe COVID, stops hospitalizations, and stops deaths. So it's 85% against that severe COVID, but increases over time and no cases past that 28-day rate. What's really interesting is you look at 14 days after, and J&J had a really nice trial where they actually tracked required medical interventions. It was a specific category you could pull out. After 14 days, 75% decrease. After 28 days, 100% decrease. So that's great news. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, yeah, you might get a little cold, you might get the sniffles, you might get moderate, you might feel bad for a couple days, but no one's going to the hospital with it, and no one's died from it after 28 days after getting that shot. That's great news. And importantly, that included those variants of concern. That included that B1351, the strain that we're really worried about. It's still effective at stopping hospitalizations and deaths against that strain. That is really good news. The other thing, we didn't see the anaphylaxis that we saw with some of the Pfizer and Moderna shots. The adverse events were actually around 10 times less. You know, those reactions you get after your shot are actually 10 times less with J&J versus the Moderna vaccine. They are testing a follow-on 2-dose regimen 2 months after your first shot. I think it's likely, especially with these variants of concern out there, we'll probably see that 2-dose regimen. So just because you get J&J, I would say, you know, whatever vaccines offered you, take that vaccine. If it's J&J, take it. My guess is you will probably get a booster shot of J&J, whether it's tailored for South Africa or whether it's just a second booster shot sometime later. They were going to also look at kids. One of the other primary vaccines that's out in the world is the AstraZeneca vaccine. There's been a lot of question around it. It's hard to know what the ground truth is. The EMA, the WHO, and UK have all approved it. There's some variability in terms of how effective it is with older folks. The US has a fairly robust trial underway with AstraZeneca, so we'll know more then in terms of how effective it is. And the FDA is going to wait for those trials to complete before they decide whether they're going to approve or not. We hope to see the results of those trials sometime this month or next month. You know, the one thing I would say is that the UK, you know, has pushed really hard on AstraZeneca, and their numbers have gone down and even have continued to go down even while the rest of Europe is plateauing. And they're only doing 1 shot. They're actually waiting 3 months between shots. So it's got to have some level of efficacy. We're just not sure how well it's doing. Some recent studies show it's actually doing pretty well. So I wait for the US trial. The 5th one out there is Novavax. So this is a brand new company that's out there. They have a fascinating way they create their vaccine. They actually use moth cells to grow the spike proteins that allow then your antibodies, your immune system respond to it, and they combine that with soap bark tree compound to bring all those cells together. It's really fascinating if you look at it of how they do it. Novavax, though, has never brought a vaccine to market. They've never had one approved, so we'll have to see how well they can do at the manufacturing. When a company like J&J has had issues with manufacturing, let's see whether Novavax can do it. Their numbers have been pretty good. They've done international trials. They're very effective against the B117, which we would expect, as most of the vaccines have been, and 60% against South Africa. So similar numbers to what we saw with J&J. The scary part, though, is when they looked at their trial participants from South Africa, about 1/3 of those participants had received reinfections. So they had that original strain, and it looks like they got reinfected with that South African strain. So again, as we go forward, that really is the big concern. I think we're going to vaccinate people really quickly. The question is, how well does our acquired immunity work in the near term, and how well does our vaccinated immunity work against those strains as we go forward? So it's not just that reinfection rate, it's the fact that do our vaccines stop transmission? You know, am I a risk to others after I've been vaccinated? So I would say generally no. We looked, like we said, we talked about the Moderna, that second, you know, before that second dose, you know, 62% reduction in asymptomatic infections, which is actually really good. Great news out of Israel in terms of that 90% number. And even better, though, we've seen across multiple different types of vaccines a reduction in the amount of viral loading that you get. So, you know, when they swab you for that PCR test, they put it in a little vial and they actually amplify it. And that's usually cycle thresholds. So the lower number of amplifications it takes for you to detect it, that means there was more to start with. So they use these things called these CT values. The higher number of CT values, the less there was there to start with. So that's how they can track what that viral loading is. So what they've shown, though, and this has been shown now in 4 or 5, 6 different studies with different vaccines, they're getting lower viral loading from those that have been vaccinated. So this is really good news. This means not only do we stop or reduce, you know, asymptomatic infections, there's, you know, people aren't getting sick, but when you do get sick, it's reducing that viral loading. We saw one out of Israel for 4 times reduction. Another one out of the UK showed a 10 times reduction in viral loading. So this is likely to decrease the transmission after you've been vaccinated with any of the vaccines, you know, potentially greater than 90%. Now, again, the strains, the variants of concern, we're not sure how it's going to affect that. Because the B117 has been so prevalent, we know it works for that. We know it works for the original one. We just don't know how well these numbers work for the other variants of concern. So we look at vaccine production. So we're tracking this. I will say in ABA, we actually started a pool to see, you know, when we thought our little group would get their first shot of the vaccine. So highly recommend it. It's fun for you guys. Try and predict when you're going to get it. I picked an April timeframe, just so everyone knows. But we were looking around 45 to 50 million vaccines a month. We averaged this around in February. The one key here, though, is that our vaccination rates haven't necessarily been limited by what we can administer. It's been limited by the doses that can be distributed. Commercial Pharmacies Association came out, early on and said they could administer 50 million vaccinations a month alone, just from the commercial. We know there's mass vaccination sites being set up in different cities. We know FEMA's helping with it, National Guard and other. So if we can increase this production rate, we can actually significantly increase the rate that people get shots in arms. So when we look at the financial sector, it's what we track at the American Bankers Association. We were in phase 1C. Phase 1B was taking care of our healthcare workers. Phase 1A was healthcare workers, those at high risk. Phase 1B is, some essential employees, those high risk medical conditions. And then phase 1C was other essential workers and, a lot of other Americans. The great news is we've done a really good job of taking care of our healthcare workers, as well as those in long-term care facilities. Deaths and hospitalizations are dropping significantly. Infection rates in those facilities are dropping significantly. So this is all really great news. And I think we're going to start moving into those other phases relatively quickly. The issue is that states really have taken this over. Some have now moved into a total age-based, some haven't. It's really hard to know where you're going to fall because it's totally dependent on each state. But in a worst case scenario, let's say we just maintain what we've got in terms of our distribution rates. We're still looking, now remember, these numbers are against the 266 million Americans that can be vaccinated. It doesn't include the children 16 and younger. Now, they're a lower risk, so I think that it's okay to not include them when we talk about those herd immunity and others. But we're still looking at having, herd immunity is generally 70 to 80% of people vaccinated. We're looking at that sometime in July or August. That's not bad. Now, when we look at what we've seen in terms of the increased production rates, we're looking a lot better. All the major manufacturers have come out now and are starting to say that they believe they can achieve an additional 120 million doses or achieve deliveries of 120 million doses total by March for Pfizer, 100 million for Moderna by in March, and then 40 million for J&J in March. So they've already delivered 100 million by the end of February. So if you add that up, you're at 240 million minus 100 million. They're supposedly going to deliver 140 million doses of vaccine by the end of this month. That would be astounding. So let's say they achieve 90 million. Let's say, let's lower that number. And if you're tracking the rates right now, that's about what we're at. We're at 80 million. Hopefully they'll keep going up. But the actual numbers we've got in here show from February, this is where we stand in terms of one shot, it's 19%, two shots around 10%. But if we can achieve that 90 million for the month of March, 76 million for Pfizer, Moderna, 20 million for J&J, I think this is really achievable. You're already at almost half the population vaccinated with at least one shot by the end of the month. You go into April, you're already at 76% of the population. You look at May at 103% for the one shot. So that's why you hear President Biden and others coming out and saying every American who wants a shot by the end of May can get one. It is eminently achievable that we reach that goal. If we can do that, it's going to have a significant impact on the spread of the virus. So what does it mean from an effect on operations? So we know that vaccines protect the individual. They still allow infection. Remember, we don't have sterilizing immunity. Now, the good news is that the Pfizer, Moderna get really close to that for the original strain and the B117 strain. It's still not sterilizing immunity, but it's effective immunity. And you can still transmit that virus. So that means if you're in a mixed environment, especially in an office space or an internal space, you're going to need to take some level of public health precautions. There's still going to be people that can't necessarily get vaccinated. They have an ADA exemption, a medical exemption, a sincerely held religious belief. And so we're not necessarily going to be able to open everything up and do everything that we want to do. You're still going to need masks in public spaces and other things like that. Because again, you might be vaccinated, but you might get one of those new strains. You might get moderate COVID. You might be able to spread that more. So you're going to need to take some level of precautions. The really, really good news is they do an amazing job at stopping hospitalizations and death. All of them. J&J, Pfizer, Moderna vaccine, even against those variants of concern. So when I get vaccinated, I plan on going out and meeting people. If I'm in public though, I'm going to wear my mask. I'm going to go to a restaurant. I haven't been sat in a restaurant for the past year. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I won't do it until I'm vaccinated because I haven't gotten the COVID yet. So I'm very excited about that. And really the big concern is that long COVID. I'm relatively healthy. I think I'd be fine. Whether I get those long COVID symptoms, which we see about a third of the people get, is really my main concern. And the jury is out on vaccines and how well they stop that. We know they reduce the viral loading. We know they reduce the severity of the disease. It makes sense they'd reduce long COVID. We know that people who have long COVID, who've gotten the vaccine, seem to show a decrease in symptoms or an improvement in symptoms. So there's hope, but there's really been no studies that correlate that. So at ABA, we're planning our reintroduction of staff to work. We know that as more people get vaccinated, we're probably going to have more people coming in the office. What does that mean from a conference room perspective? We're probably going to differentiate, and we're going to track between vaccinated people or who's gotten the vaccine. You're allowed to do this. The EEOC has come out and said that clearly. It's not a disability-related inquiry. And so we're going to track when people get their shots. We're going to know as the percent of vaccinations rise, we'll consider reopening different things. We're going to allow people who are vaccinated, assuming our local public health allows it, to meet in conference rooms without masks. You know, the one thing you have to remember, there is no silver bullets. There are no more, no more bullets in the chamber. The vaccine is it. We're going to have to figure out how to live with this disease with the tools we've got. And so what are those risks that we're willing to accept? We look at conferences. I think it's reasonable, depending on where those infection curves go, that you could have a conference in June or July, more likely July, August, September. That's kind of what we're looking at, that Q3 number where you could have in-person events. You're gonna have to figure out what level, are you gonna only allow vaccinated people to come? Because unvaccinated people are still potentially gonna be at risk. So what level of risk are you going to accept? How are you going to differentiate in those hybrid events? It's gonna be something we struggle with as we reopen. So where do we go from here? So cases have plateaued. They're dropping a little bit this week, which is really good news. But we're on that fulcrum point that we're not sure where we're going to go. My big concern is, our kids have been relatively well protected against this. States like Texas and Mississippi that are dropping mask mandates, if they drop those in schools, you now have a potentially naive population. And we know, any parent knows, schools are incubators of disease. I don't think it's any simple, it's a simple correlation. When the schools are in session, flu season seems to come around a lot more. If we're starting to have schools or these gatherings where people meet unmasked, and you have people that haven't been exposed before, and we have this B117 strain that's extremely transmissive, are we going to see a large rise or an increase in cases? It's possible. That's the big fear. If we reopen too quickly, what's going to happen? So it's really these next 2 to 4 weeks. Can we get enough shots in arms to reduce that spread? We know we've already got acquired immunity from a large part of the population to stop that additional spread. The fear, though, is that some of these places that are reopening, Texas, Florida, have the highest rates of the B117 strain that are out there. And so that's really just to watch that. But, the one thing is, as these vaccinations go out, I think people are going to change their perspective. And I think that one thing that really puts it in perspective, and some people have a knee-jerk reaction to this, when you compare the flu to COVID, because there were deniers out there that wasn't bad. I think clearly we could say 500,000 deaths in a year from COVID. It's much worse than the flu. There's no doubt. But when we look at COVID after vaccination, and we've got that Israeli study, 1.2 million people, 600,000 vaccinated, 600,000 unvaccinated. We look at those vaccinated people. We look at the rate of hospitalizations day 0 after that second dose. So it's day 0. That rate of hospitalization was 3.7 out of every 100 million. Really, really low. Actually, if you went to day 7 after that dose 2, it was 0 out of 100,000. So to me, I'm not a medical doctor. 3.7. Well, it seems like you're still seeing hospitalizations. Well, we live with the flu for a long time. We get around 200,000 hospitalizations a year, except for last year because we did a really good job masking and social distancing. We live with the flu. We get 200,000. That translates to 150,000 or 150 people per 100,000 that are hospitalized every year with the flu. So when you look at the relative risks post-COVID vaccination, remember that's the key, that's much lower. And so I think we're just going to have to recognize that COVID's not going to go away. It's going to become endemic. There's a lot of questions on, does it turn into a common cold? Does it turn into a type of influenza? Are there going to be booster shots? All those things aren't necessarily known. I think we probably will have boosters, whether it's yearly or over 3 years, unknown. Whether it gets an injury with a flu shot, unknown. But I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. But post-vaccination, our risks are a lot lower. And so I think you're going to start seeing a much grander reopening, knock on wood, sometime this summer, when a lot more people are vaccinated and we start seeing a lower of incidence of disease. The big question is just how much those strains affect everything else. And I think we're going to see some numbers, if case rates are dropping down to 20s and 30s, 4 or 6 weeks from now, I think we're on a great trajectory. It's certainly possible we could be on a slow burn at the 40, 50, 60, 70,000. I'm hopeful we don't see those peaks again because we got a lot of acquired immunity out there, and the vaccines, while not perfect against those new strains, work pretty well. So that's really where we're at. The best news is our hospitals have been able to catch their breath. We saw people rationing oxygen. Ambulances couldn't stop in LA because they didn't have a place to drop them off. We're not going to see that. We're going to see better care for those that do get really sick, because our hospital workers are vaccinated against it. They're less likely to get really sick from it. They're less likely to see extreme loading in the hospitals. So we're going to be able to manage this a lot better. So I'm really hopeful we're exiting this dark tunnel that we call COVID, and I'm hopeful that sometime in the summertime we're going to start seeing people gathering and getting together again. But wear your mask in the meantime, and let's get a chance to get more people vaccinated. That's it. Am I supposed to hand it over to you, Peter?
Be a friend of Aubrey. So let's are we okay to get going? All right, I guess so. Paul's giving me the okay. So all right, okay. My name is Peter Raschuti. I teach finance at Tulane University. The reason I know Hoppy is because 27 years ago I started a program called Birkenroad Reports, where I take 200 students every year, divide them up into teams of 5, and each team is assigned to follow one of 40 small cap publicly traded companies in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And of course, Hoppy's Bank, the first, is one of the companies we follow. We also follow People's Bank down at the coast. We also write reports on Cal-Maine, largest distributor of eggs. East Group, a very interesting REIT that's headquartered in Jackson, and that's a company that owns all these terminals and warehouses really along I-10 would be the way to think about it, coast to coast. And Sanderson Farms, which the Sanderson family and Crockville have been very, very big, kind to us. And we have the best field trips in the free world. We've taken helicopters to offshore oil rigs. We've gone to steel mills. We've gone to chicken processing plants. If you've never been to a chicken processing plant, do take the family. That is a nice outing. And, I don't have a mean bone in my body, but the one mean thing I like to do is I like to take the prissiest students and put them on the toughest field trips. So that's, I always think it's like all of a sudden they're at the Sanderson Farms trip. So let's see where I'm going in here. The reason I bring all that up, we were the #1 experiential learning program in the world, all of that. But the reason I bring it up is that I'm blessed to have a front row seat to the region's economy. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here this morning. Let's see. I'm sharing. So that's a good sign. All right. Okay. Here we go. See, a disclaimer, don't sue me. There's don't take any of this too seriously. Couple of things I thought we'd start off is, what does the recovery look like? There's been I don't think we still know what the shape of the recovery is. Some people think we're going to have a U-shaped recovery. That kind of looks like maybe that's going to be, and that's when you fall off a cliff, you kind of meander around for a while and slowly but surely get back to where you were, or even higher. The next one that you see is the V-shaped recovery, where you basically the end of March you sort of collapse and then you spring right back up to new highs. Interestingly enough, I don't think that's true for the economy, but it is certainly true for the stock market. The stock market since the end of March it's been the greatest comeback since Lazarus. It is just incredible what has been done. It's one of the biggest rallies I've ever seen, and I've been doing this for 42 years. And then the W-shaped recovery, which is we've seen this as well. This is actually the part that you fear, because this is where you go out, come out of the recession, you come out of the COVID situation, you go up, things get better, then you open up and things get worse and you have to keep closing down and up and down again. This is a real blow to consumer confidence and a real blow to business confidence. So you really ideally want to avoid this at all costs. Some permanent changes from the business-wise from the pandemic. First is, I think we're going to see simpler supply chains. We're going to see more things produced in the US, more produced in Mexico, more produced in Canada. The idea that you're building a plant and you're looking for a piece of plastic that's coming from South Korea might not be as attractive to you right now. When you look at companies, I think if before the pandemic, what investors really cared about, what companies really wanted was just the lowest cost possible. And now I think they're going to be looking for a low cost but resiliency, and I think that's very important. Companies are going to get more efficient. You know, in the last year, companies have not just sat on their hands. They maybe did that for a couple of weeks, but they are really, they've pushed in directions they were going anyway. Much more digital, much more efficient, smaller headcounts. I think one of the parts about this recovery that's going to surprise people is that not everybody's going back to work. They have found a lot of ways to get by with fewer people, particularly on the retail side. And I think we're going to have some unemployment issues from that. Companies have succession plans. I guess they always had them, but nobody ever paid any attention. But when you saw people die or get very sick, it became very, very important about what kind of depth strength you had. Investors were always asking about that. And greater buying online. I don't think, I mean, once you've done it, and once you've done it in all these different fields, it's tough to go back. So I think they continue to get a bigger market share. Main Street woes, you've got the thousands of bankruptcies, more than 100,000 businesses have shut their doors for good. You had the winter spike in COVID cases. We still don't know if we're going to get the stimulus package. Maybe we'll know it this month. When you see the big recovery numbers that people are projecting, they are projecting in the stimulus package. So if it doesn't go through, people are going to have to dial it down a little bit. And massive unemployment. You know, we're going back little by little by little. And as I mentioned, I don't think everybody's going back. What is happening is exactly what you think happened, which is white collar workers like us have been able to work from home. We're probably going to be one of the, and then kind of go back as we feel comfortable. Whereas the difficult thing is people on the front lines, whether you're working at a Starbucks or whatever, you really didn't have that option. My hometown, New Orleans, is, and by the way, Tulane is doing great. You know, the last 5 years, we've averaged 40,000 applicants for 1,700 freshman slots. And I will tell you that one of the reasons we have that is we are the only school in the country that has mandatory community service. We started doing that after Katrina. And these kids are great kids. I know there's a tendency, everybody thinks the next generation are a bunch of slackers and all. They're not. They're terrific. They're much more community minded than we were. I think it's pretty terrific, and that's one reason they come to Tulane. They have to do it. The things that run New Orleans, the generators, have really been clobbered. I don't think any city is in worse shape. I don't mean that. I don't mean that really in a fiscal sense. In terms of how badly they were hurt during the pandemic, tourism basically fell off the map. Live music, which we're known for, you really couldn't go into a club anymore. Festivals, there was a festival every single weekend in Louisiana. Restaurants, another thing we're really great at. Conventions have basically been closed down. I was talking to Paul earlier today, and he thought maybe the third quarter, fourth quarter would start to see them. Sports, you know, not only the Saints and the Pelicans and LSU and Tulane and all that, but you know, the Final Four, all those kind of things has been pulled out. And then oil and gas, which is another pretty important industry, less so each year, but the demand for oil, the demand for gas collapsed, and that really sent the unemployment gates just reeling in that industry. So we will have to see, but it kind of gives you some perspective. What about, why are stocks up? That seems to be the thing people always ask about. I mean, we're still struggling, and we still don't know how long it's going to be till we really get our footing. And yet stocks have soared since the end of March. Well, a couple of things. Investors are forward looking. They're looking beyond where we are now. They're looking 6 to 9 months down the road. And that's why it's very difficult to make money in the market. You can't really look at where we are now or where we were. You're trying to figure out where we're going to be. In the third quarter, because the fourth quarter numbers aren't entirely in, I'll give you that. In the over 50% in the third quarter, over 50% of companies, public companies, reported earnings higher than they did in the third quarter of 2019. Now that is sort of shocking, but it's giving you an idea of how companies have recovered, how they've become more efficient, and being able to turn it into earnings. That's a number I think most people would have said 10%, and it's actually over 50%. Big companies are taking market share from moms and pops. Good for public companies. I don't think that's particularly great. New Orleans, for instance, is really known for its nobody comes to New Orleans to eat at Applebee's, I would think that. And so this is happening for a couple of reasons. One is the big companies have access to capital that the small companies don't, the mom and pops. And of course, they can not only to get that capital, but at very, very, very low interest rates. The promise of low interest rates seems to be going on forever. I laughed during the election. You had all these people that were, pro-Trump or pro-Biden, and they were split down the middle. And really, the most important person to us is neither. It is Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, will decide how the economy goes. So we were really having a ridiculous argument back then. The stock market, and this is if you could walk away with one thing today, it's the stock market is not the economy. The stock market is a measure of future corporate profits. It doesn't care if people are happy or they're employed or they're making any money. They care about corporate profits, and they're not looking at it now. They're looking at it 6 to 9 months down the road. And that's why the stock market has had this enormous recovery when the rest of us are still kind of, very tentative in what we're doing. I want to give you a little confidence in me. This is a stock picking contest I was in a few years ago. They put me against one of the top financial minds in this country, Mike Ditka, the former coach. And so I did beat the coach in a stock picking contest. That's kind of sad, really, that I had to do that. But I also do. The other reason I think I have a great idea of the economy in this region is I host a radio show on National Public Radio here in New Orleans called Out to Lunch. And every week I take 2 business people, 2 entrepreneurs, whatever the combination is, and we bring them to Commander's Palace, which is one of the greatest restaurants in the world. And we have a nice kind of open, easy conversation about the trials and joys of running a business and what they see. So that's been a lot of fun. We've had amazing guests, and I am the most optimistic guy in the region. And the reason is, really 2 reasons. One, I host this show and I see all these new ideas that are coming up in this area, and it just blows your mind. The second is I work with young people, and young people are great. They're energetic, they're really smart, and they want to change the world, and I would not bet against them. They've got a lot of things they would like to change, whether it's in regard to the climate and environmental, or it's the way people are treated, or income inequality. These folks are there, and these are business students. So I just want to kind of point that out to you. The oil thoughts, the oil industry has been clobbered, and the news is that it's never coming back. We're going to have to tell them at some point. But the bottom line is there are better alternatives out there. What happened, of course, was 2014, which is now, that's like 7 years ago. The Saudis were tired of the U.S. taking part of the market share, so they let prices fall where they may. You got a picture that for 42 years, the Saudis had determined where oil prices were going to be through OPEC. So it was like, let it go. And of course, it went from $113 to $28. I used to be the chief investment officer for the state of Louisiana up at the Treasury, managed $3 billion for the state up there. And I'm glad I wasn't there when that happened, because every dollar change in the price of a barrel of oil sets the Louisiana budget up and down $13 million. So that is something, that's a huge number to get your arms around. Oil price pressures. Short term, they're finding some pretty cheap ways to bring up oil, but some $30, $40 break evens. But long term, and this is the story, alternative fuels, fuel efficiency, and ride sharing. In other words, not only are we getting electric cars, but cars are running longer on the same amount of gas, and people are doing everything from like Uber to Lyft and all of that. And that's decreased the demand. It's going to continue to decrease demand for gasoline. Now, here's the important point for the oil industry, is that 70% of all oil is used for transportation. So it gets obviously refined into gas. 70% is used for transportation. This is going to be very different. I'm going to tell you, but the big 3 automakers in Germany, VW, Mercedes, and BMW, have said that by 2030, they no longer intend to make an internal combustion engine. If that's not a shot across the bow, I don't know what is. And it's funny because my age, I think that's incredibly aggressive. And my sons, who were in their early 20s, are asking why it would take so long. So kind of, by the way, It is finally good to be old. I had not wished I was older till I was 17 trying to buy a beer. And now I get the vaccination. So cheer up out there. The other one is that some of the major oil CEOs have come out and said they think oil demand will start to peak by 2030. That's right, same number. So we can see it coming. And it is not some flighty thing. It is what's happening. Even if you watch the US car commercials, like during the Super Bowl, nobody had 5 minutes on the idea of, I'm going to make a better internal combustion engine. The whole thing was on electric. That's where they're spending 100% of R&D, and that's what's going to happen out here. Economic impact: lower prices at the pump have helped consumers, and you know what they say? The less cash in the tank, the more junk in the trunk. That was from The Economist. No, that was from a rap song. That's where I learned that. This is good news for retailers, U.S. manufacturers, and other businesses. And it's also, this is kind of an odd way to look at it, but it's defending a lot of the U.S. foes. The people that really don't like us, like Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, are really not even countries. They're all gas stations. And when oil prices fell, they really have been clobbered, their economy. And by the way, if you want to know, you've seen oil go back to about $60 a barrel. I don't think it'll stick there, but also, I'll tell you why it doesn't work. You could probably make a few bucks at $60, but let's take offshore Gulf of Mexico. These are like billion-dollar projects out there. From the time they get that lease to the time they found the oil and brought it back to start to sell it is about 4 years. So just picture that you're going to spend $1 billion on something where in 4 years you do not have a clue as to what you're going to sell it for. Is it $100 a barrel? Is it 50 cents a barrel? You have no idea. So we will have to see where this shakes out. In other words, back to be honest with the oil industry, when it was run by wildcatters and kind of kind of people, they may have gone for it, but they're run by MBAs now. So these aren't the kind of risks that people are willing to take. You see the electric cars in here, and one of the things you hear from people all the time is, I'm driving an electric car. Where are you going to fill it up? Whole Food? And of course, how capitalism works. And capitalism works so that you're going to go to bed when we get a certain point. I don't know what it is. Maybe 5% of the fleet is electric. You're going to go to bed on a Tuesday night with not a single charging station in your neighborhood and wake up Wednesday morning. They're going to be on every corner. This is the way it's going to go. And so everybody's waiting for that tipping point, but it's closer than people believe. I talked to one of our Birkenroad companies, a trucking company, and I said to them, when do you think you'll have driverless trucks and electric engines? And he said to me, and of course, the way he worded this made me clear that he had been asked technology questions in the past. He said, Peter, I'd give you a number, but it's sooner than that. And isn't that the truth? Whatever number we have for changes and all of that and technology, it's coming quicker than we could have ever believed. And that's just going to continue to go in here. The distinction, by the way, we're going to need, first of all, we're going to need a ton of energy. I'm not at all talking about a downturn in the need for energy. I'm talking about the fact that fossil fuels will produce a lot less, smaller parts of that pie, but the pie is getting really big and it's going to only grow from here. Electricity is generated by natural gas, coal, solar, and wind. About 4 years ago, natural gas outdid coal as the single largest fuel producer. But planes, trains, automobiles are run entirely by oil or the derivative gasoline. So that kind of gives you where this is going. If you look at future fuel, what's going to produce this electricity, and these numbers change all the time, but basically the trend is right. Less of that is going to be produced by coal in terms of the percentages, less by nuclear, more by renewables, and more by natural gas. So it is renewables and natural gas that are really going to power electricity as we go forward here, at least in the next decade or two. If you want to know that coal has had it, this is the Kentucky Coal Museum, which is now powered by solar. I think that's the end. I really do. And they're very, this coal industry is very, very small at this point. The number of people employed in coal is actually much less than the number of people employed at Arby's. Kind of gives you a good example on that. This is, I think, the most interesting thing in energy. It's actually mostly happening in Southwest Louisiana over to the Texas border. If you're not familiar with it, it is pretty phenomenal. It's liquefied natural gas. What's going on is we have so much extra natural gas in this country just tons of it. Natural gas, around Katrina sold at $15 a thousand cubic feet. Now it's about $3. It's gone down an awful lot, and it's everywhere. Every pipeline is filled, every storage capacity, all those ships are all filled. There's nowhere left to put the gas. And so what they've done is pretty fascinating. They find gas in these, West Texas, or maybe it's over in the shale in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and they've developed pipelines, and they send those pipelines down to Southwest Louisiana. And then they take that natural gas, and this is kind of metaphysical. They take that natural gas and they freeze it, way beyond freezing. They drop it to 265 degrees below zero. That is cold. And it shrinks the natural gas into 1/600th of its size. Then they put it on these ships that I have in the picture, and they send it abroad. Now, why do they do that? Well, because it's an arbitrage play. They can get natural gas for about $3, and even when you factor in the transportation and the cooling and all that, they make a lot of money, because in Europe, it sells for about $6 a thousand cubic feet, and in Asia, about $10 to $11. So even with all the efforts you had to put this in, you can make a lot of money. There's been $50 billion invested in the Louisiana-Texas border there for liquefied natural gas. And this is a really a credible story. A couple of things that you hear a lot of economic misinformation. Like, for instance, you hear, we don't manufacture much in this country. That is so untrue. The level of US manufacturing is higher than it's ever been, but with far fewer workers because of efficiency and productivity, which if you didn't have that, you wouldn't even have any market share. And if you look at it, 87% of job losses in manufacturing are due to efficiency, automation, and robotics. So, the scapegoats are companies are going abroad, or immigrants are taking the jobs in here, and that's just not true. In fact, a few years ago, when my sons were younger, I guess it was about over 10 years ago, I took them to go see the Coca-Cola bottling facility in New Orleans. It was brand new, and I kind of wanted to see it. It was super efficient. It was like 3 times the size of the Superdome, and I swear there are only about 6 people working in there. And it's all robots. And every new plant built for manufacturing looks like that. I always remember, because at the end, the management that was given the tour, the manager said to me and my sons, he goes, you know what I like about robots? He goes, they don't have fights with their wives. They don't come in hungover. And of course, my sons are at that point are like 10 and 7. They're like, whoa, stranger danger, So, but that is the truth. If you're looking for investment focusing, and that's what we usually do, we try to find industries we think are going to do very well. Infrastructure is going to do very well, and it's the only thing that people are going to reach across the aisle on. We need better roads, better schools, better bridges, better connectivity. It's going to happen, and it's very much needed. A lot of the bridges you're driving over, particularly in small places, were built under the WPA in the 30s, so they're falling apart. So in our roads, some of them are pretty deplorable. This is going to be a great effort in the next several years, and I think companies involved in that are going to do very well. Renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar or anything else, that's going to be getting a big push in here, mainly because the economics work. Now, education, we've got a long way to go to make our workforce what it needs to be to compete in the world economy. And then healthcare. The baby boomers, I guess the oldest baby boomer is probably now around 77 years old or something like that. And we need a lot of work. So you get much more things falling apart now. This is sort of interesting, is unemployment rates versus stocks. Like, you have probably been told, particularly, when you were young and your father told you, and your grandfather and your grandfather's father, all said to you, don't invest in the market when the economy is bad and with high unemployment. But the truth of the matter is, it's just the opposite. It's an inverse relationship. If unemployment is below 4.5%, remember we were just before the pandemic, the average return on the market is about 8.35% over the next 12 months. The average overall in the last 100 years is 10%, but below average there. If it's between 4.5% and 5%, it's 8.69. But when it gets higher, when it's between 5.5 and 6.8, the average return going forward is 14.61%. And if it's higher than 6.8%, which is where we were at the peak of the pandemic, the average return over the next 12 months is 18.73%. So when people looked like they were if you went anywhere, because you couldn't go anywhere because you couldn't meet anybody, but if you told people you were buying stocks last spring, they thought you were nuts. And but this data does play it out. This goes back once again about 100 years. The business cycle, what we're seeing now is, if you look at, we're in the early cycle of the recovery. Fiscal and monetary stimulus, we're definitely seeing that. Economic growth starts to increase. Companies are pretty lean, and so they can not only is business coming up, but because they're so lean, their profits really soar. Then you go into mid-cycle, margins start to peak. Management starts to begin share repurchases. We've seen a lot of that in the last cycle. We're not quite there yet. The late cycle, you see fiscal and monetary restrictions because the economy is getting too hot, and trouble finding available workers. One of the things I ask people on these company visits and on the radio show is I ask them, what keeps you up at night? And before this all happened, every single person said the same thing, is finding workers. And by the way, on this radio show, we have the most amazing people. We had two women on just before the pandemic, and they were, let's say they were 27, 28 years old at age. We were attending a lot of weddings, and she noticed how much people were paying for flowers. So she created a company to rent flowers for weddings. They're artificial flowers. I had it laying on the table in front of me over lunch. I couldn't tell the difference. They even come in a box that smells like flowers. The flowers recycled, they get to use them all over again. You can't even imagine how good the margins are here. The new generation wants to recycle things. They don't want to just kill some plants and throw it back out. And just before COVID, they were doing 400 weddings a month. So these are people you don't even see in the region. You really don't. And yet, there's people doing very, very well. There's a lot of smart, innovative people. We have a company coming from Brookhaven in a couple of months to be on the show, the Great Mississippi Tea Company, that prides himself on growing tea in a better environmental way. But also, bottom line is the tea is delicious. So, and then you get a contraction, you get a late cycle, and then finally the downturn, economic contraction, falling manufacturer, retail activity. We didn't get to see that. That became much quicker because of the pandemic. It was heading in that direction, but much quicker. This is what I mentioned earlier in terms of buying stock when things look terrible. This is a Fed model, and I thought you might be interested in this. This is what the Fed looks at to determine how the economy is going and how the stock market relates to the bond market. And this is what Alan Greenspan was looking at in 2000 when he drove everybody crazy with irrational exuberance. This is what they were looking at. Now it's very public. It used to be kind of a secret thing. And basically, they take the earnings per share for the S&P 500, which this year will be about 170 for 2001, and they take the price of the S&P 500 at, in this case, around 39.25, and they get that number. Now, if you do that number, the 170 divided by 39.25, you get about 4.25%. If that number, that earnings yield is what that's called, if it's higher than the yield on the 10-year Treasury, it's telling you that stocks are more attractive than bonds are. So 4.25% is higher than 1.5%, and it's telling you on a risk-return basis, using this model, which I think it's using some good factors here, it's saying that stocks are a better bet than bonds are here. One of the things is I started in this business 42 years ago when interest rates soared at the end of the Carter administration, the beginning of the Reagan administration, and I saw what happens to bonds when you have some inflation and which turns into higher interest rates. And I think I still have PTSD from that. I think I'm maybe the only one. I'm more affected by the threat of that than anyone else. But you have to remember, inflation is the enemy of financial assets. It sends interest rates up, which sends stock and bond prices down. So pretty clear on that. Over the long run, stocks move according to corporate profits. Now, it's amazing teaching financial stock equity research. It's in today's day and age when everybody's just playing GameStop. It's not all fun and GameStop. So this is really how securities are priced, and they are priced over long periods of time based on the corporate profits. And I'll show you why that backs itself up. And there's Richie Rich. I have a bunch of fake millionaires, make-believe millionaires in my report. He was a great idol of mine as a child. These are the earnings for the S&P 500, and they tell you what happened. The bottom one is 2011. Remember, we came out of the Great Recession in 2009. By 2011, we were having record earnings by the S&P 500, and they go up and up and up and up. And so did the market, went up and up and up. And then you had the pandemic in 2000. Earnings dropped from 165 to we think will end up as about 132. And this year they're expected to rise to 170. But look what happens in 2022. Over $190, certainly higher than it's ever been. And that's what investors are playing right now. They're playing, where is this economy going to look? Not now, but what do earnings look like going out to 2022? I think the reason you can use that number is it's the first full year of the recovery. Most people think the recovery will begin in earnest in a big way in the third quarter. Not so good, because Paul had mentioned this earlier, but the United States has 5% of the world's population and over 25% of the world's COVID cases and 20% of the COVID deaths. So we're not so hot at this. I don't think the leadership did a very good job on this, and we're playing a little catch up, but obviously what Paul said has made me very, very encouraged going forward. It's another thing people argue about all the time. How do stocks do? How does the market do with different presidents? If you look back at this goes back since 1976. The best return was under the Clinton administration. The second best was Barack Obama. Right underneath that was the Donald Trump administration, and George Bush, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and George Bush. George Bush actually had negative returns for both of those years. A shrinking market. Why are stocks going up? Well, the bottom line is in the first chapter of the economics book, we have more dollars chasing fewer stocks. In 1995, there were about 8,000 public companies. Now there's about 3,600 actively traded public companies. That's more dollars chasing fewer securities that are public. The difficult thing for the Fed here, and this is preaching to the choir because you're all bankers, is to keep the economy growing while holding inflation at 2% or under. And that is a very tough call. One thing I think is ridiculous is politicians telling the Feds what to do. This is absurd. The people at the Fed are the smartest, but they're smarter than me. I have friends and former students that work there. They're smarter than me. They're better dressed. They have less body fat. These are really great people, and I don't want some politician telling them what to do. An independent Fed is very, very important. Plus, they've done a pretty terrific job. Share buybacks are another reason the stocks are going up. You have companies buying back their own shares, which puts fewer shares out there to buy. Trillions of dollars in this. In fact, if you look at the 2017 tax cut, which is aimed at corporations and the very wealthy, but those corporations did very little expansion in their businesses. They mainly used to buy back stock. And why? Because if we know that earnings per share is what drives stock prices, you've got profits divided by shares outstanding equals earnings per share. So you could have the same profits and just buy back your stock, make the denominator smaller, and all of a sudden you've got increase in earnings per share and increase in what the company is going to be selling at. I think that's a big deal. By the way, people are so confused about their money. I really mean this, and I think we all owe it to everyone that we understand stuff. We owe it to increase financial literacy. I mean, Louisiana and Mississippi are 49th and 50th in financial literacy. So we've got to do, I had a guy after a speech, he came up to me and he goes, "Peter, I really enjoyed that talk. I got a big kick out of it. But it was all about stocks and bonds. So it didn't pertain to me personally because you see, all my money is in mutual funds." It's like, I guess he thought mutual funds are made of cheese. I really don't know. And remember, if you give a man a fish, he eats for one day. If you give a fish a man, he eats for like 2.5 months. There's something to remember. I think that's in the Bible. The paying down the debt. First of all, we're not going to ever pay off the debt. That's just not going to happen. But can we pay it down, or at least level it out? Well, the only ways to do it are higher taxes. Nobody wants that. Cut benefits and entitlements. Nobody wants that. Higher inflation and a weaker dollar do help us because, to a point, because we could pay foreign entities that have bought U.S. treasuries, we can pay them back in cheaper dollars. And we can't grow ourselves out of the debt. That is something people talk about, and it's ridiculous. After this bump comes from the comeback in COVID, we can't grow our GDP any higher than 2.5%. And that is not enough to pay the Fed. And the reason is, there's a couple of reasons, but one is we don't have enough people to grow that fast. And you look at it, we're at a 35-year low of making babies. That is really something. And of course, we've basically cut off immigration. And so this situation only gets worse. Big mistake investors make, I think, is that they don't invest in international securities. They represent over 50% of the market now. And most of the average investor has no investments abroad, or maybe 10% of their investments abroad. And they're missing out. Those companies in those countries have higher rates of growth. The stocks are cheaper, and they certainly add to the diversification of a portfolio. So that part is definitely true. Let's see. Oops, went back the wrong way. There we go. Borderline crazy. We haven't heard much about the tariffs recently. I don't know how many of them are going to get unwound, how many of them are going to stay, but these are really a crazy economic plan. They've never, ever worked. Larry Kudlow, who is the President Trump's economic advisor, said the tariffs are prosperity killers. Alan Greenspan said the tariffs are insane, the former chairman of the Fed. And Adam Smith, who's basically the father of economics, wrote more than 100 years ago, the whole concept of the balance of trade is absurd. The idea that we would get upset because we have an imbalance of trade. Remember, if we are on the downside of that equation, it just means that our people are richer than their people. We can afford to buy more of their goods than they can afford to buy of our goods. It isn't a terrible situation. It sounds that bad in a political stump, but it doesn't make any sense. And these tariffs on net have just hurt us. This is sort of interesting. You would not, if you go to a college campus, and I didn't say this, you wouldn't notice it, but they're decidedly female now. Tulane, I believe, is 60 to 65% female. I have friends that teach at schools that are 70, 75% female. I don't really know how to explain it. I mean, it's not like guys are off at war or something like that. I will say that if you've had a teenage boy and a teenage girl, generally, just between us, the teenage girl's a better student. Just wanted to run. I know that's a real shock to a lot of people here, but and so the real thing that's happened now is if you look at an average family, right now, this comes from the Perkins Institution, in an average family, the wife has more education than the husband does. And if you look at that graph, you can see how much room was made up. The gap was very much the other way. And I think it tells an interesting story. It tells, for you folks, it tells you that women are going to be, they are, in fact, the larger group to be focusing on for employees, for customers. A lot of people who have been in this business a long time are going to have to start to shift the way they think. This is a wonderful thing that's happening, but I think people may have to just kind of get with what the way things are right now. The good old boy network might be the good old girl network now. It has changed significantly. Very, very important, and kudos, I think, on that. Our economy is 70% consumer driven, and this is true. And so one of the things, a lot of people think the super rich are the job creators, and they're not. The middle class consumer is the job creator. In fact, this is going to sound a little bit curt, but the rich already own everything, and the poor can't afford anything. And it's the middle class that determines the strength of the economy. And one of the goals has got to be in any administration, any politician at any level, is to get a strong middle class economy, because they're the spenders. And if you do a tax cut, if you give it to the rich, I don't know, for a certain percentage, they'll go buy something. But if you give it to the middle class, they'll spend every penny of it, and they'll really generate the economy. And so that is very important. I remember right after 9/11, George Bush came out about 3 days later, and he said something that I understood. I think most of you understand, but to the general public, it did seem crazy. He said about 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, he goes, if you love America and you're patriotic, you need to go to the mall. And I think most people are like, I'm hiding under my desk, but I'll meet you in the food court. And that was true. That was exactly true. It might seem like an odd thing to say politically, but it was the exact story. So let's see. Here's some general knowledge. You may know this, may not, but in a few more months, we're going to be flying again and driving and using rental cars. The biggest problem with a rental car, right, is you rent the car, and then when you bring it back that Hertz is going to charge you like $15 a gallon to refill it, which is it's why they call it Hertz. And so you go out and you drive around, do your appointed rounds, then you come back and then you panic just before you get to the airport and you find a gas station there. And it really, not only are you at the end of your rope and not a lot of extra time, but then you realize I don't have any idea what side of the car the gas goes in. But the truth is that in every dashboard, you look at the gas gauge, it has a little gas pump and an arrow, and that's where the gas goes in. So really, if you got nothing else out of this, you'd say, years from now, you go, what did the Italian man say again? So we will see. Demographics are over the next 30 years, the population of working age people. Now that's the most important metric you can come up with, that you can come up with, because that is what determines the strength of an economy. So ours will grow steadily and slowly. Now, all of it's because of immigration, because we, not making babies. It'll be declining in many parts of the industrial world, including Europe, China, and Japan. If you want to see what happens without immigration, just take a look at Japan. They are just dying on the vine over there because of the way they have set their things, their rules up. Immigration, over 40% of the Fortune 500 was started by immigrants or their children, which is kind of amazing. At Intel's Science Talent Search, they do this nationally in national pool. Less than 20% of the applicants had parents born in the US. So that gives you an idea of where the brain power is. And 25% of the nation's physicians are foreign born. And everybody appreciated that during the front part of the pandemic. Which inning? I'm a big baseball fan. I've been to all 30 major league parks. And so I put the Red Sox scoreboard in there. The last expansion lasted 128 months. Now that was a record. And the bull market went on for just under 12 years. That was a record. But since World War II, the average economic expansion is about 90 months. So you see it was longer. It could be longer. That was significantly longer. But this is kind of 90 months is what you ought to be thinking about for a cycle. This is some great work we've done at the university, and it shows that interest rates are directly tied to the height of the Fed chairman. I don't want you to share it with anyone else, but damn good work. Is that you remember Volcker was like about 6'6", and rates were very, very high, and then Greenspan was much smaller and rates went down, and then Bernanke was even smaller, and Janet Yellen was kind of tiny. Rates kept going down and down. And Jerome Powell's like average height. He's about 6 feet. So using this design, I think interest rates will go up at some point. So I would keep this with you. I would make a copy of this and send it and have it in your pocket all the time. Saving capitalism, which I think is a big, big deal. I mean, we have such income inequality now that something's going to break. You could even argue our political differences right now are based on that. But here's a good example. At the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the top 3% of the French elites, which is a name we're using again now, commanded 30% of the country's wealth. And you had a revolution. You had that nice woman who got her head cut off, that Marie woman. Today, the top 3% in the U.S. have 40% of all the country's wealth. And that is a very scary situation in terms of keeping content a population. The most recent recovery, actually, I could use this 3 times. If you look at 9/11, if you look at 2008, and you look at the pandemic, they all had this odd shape recovery that I didn't mention earlier. And that is what they call the K-shaped recovery, which is the economy collapses, and then suddenly it falls for everybody, and suddenly the upper class start to do better. And the reason is that the Fed starts lowering interest rates to boost the economy. But by doing that, it helps people with assets. So if you have stocks, bonds, real estate, these lower prices, lower interest rates push the prices up, so they make great gains. If you go down to the lower classes and the middle class, they don't have those investments. If they do, what they have is a CD or a money market fund that's actually hurt by the lower interest rates. So this is why we see this perpetuate. Now, interestingly enough, Jerome Powell, who ultimately makes this call, has done paper after paper and speech after speech about that income inequality is the biggest problem facing the United States economy going forward over the next 20 years. So it's kind of ironic in a way. I mean, he was using a tool that actually, perpetuated it, but it worked, and that's the only way we know how to do things. If you want to have something to worry about, you just like to worry, I would worry about the public pension system. Don't worry about Social Security and Medicare and all that, because the federal government has a printing press, which is very helpful. In fact, when I was at the state, I thought we ought to get our own currency, maybe a little alligator in the middle with a squeeze box playing Zydeco music. But there's about $4 trillion in public pension funds. And the average public pension fund is only 70 to 75% funded, which means if you stopped right now, they would only have 70 to 75% enough to pay the people, the beneficiaries. That's amazingly scary. And the average public fund assumes a 7.25% annual rate of return, which, I'll give you an example. When we have endowment money at Tulane, we assume 5%. So the reason they do that, of course, is so that the state can put less money in it, or the city, or the municipality. So this is a big problem that people don't talk about. I remember in Louisiana, when I would have to testify in front of that committee, the pension board, the pension committee that you'd have to pass legislation through, were basically people that had been sentenced to the pension boards. They were out of favor with the governor or something like that. People don't want to deal with this, but it's a huge problem. Political decisions or political will. And this is going to touch two things I mentioned earlier. Politicians, and this is just human nature. It's not throwing stones at anybody, any party, any level of government. They tend to want to look at the issues with short-term payoffs. That's what attracts them. And that's what gets funded, because they can really show, I did this during my term and I can get reelected. The real problems, though, are long-term problems that just don't appeal politically to politicians. Important issues such as early childhood education, which has been shown to be the single best place you can put a dollar in terms of making a difference, and firming up the public pension systems. They won't reap benefits for decades. You fix early childhood development, you're going to see a change in your workforce 15, 20 years from now. It's a big deal. By the way, for Louisiana and Texas, educating that workforce early on, job training later and early on, is the only way we're going to get out of that 49th, 50th status. We cannot compete on jobs just simply on low wages and loose environmental restrictions. You're just going to get the same problem over and over again. You need a smarter workforce. And I hope both states can make the moves to make that happen. Interestingly enough, what should get funded, and I think it will, is infrastructure, because infrastructure has both camps going for it. Short term is a lot more jobs, not only jobs, but you see people working, which makes people think things are going better. And long-term benefits, you're going to get the better roads and bridges and connectivity and all of that. Let's see, I've got a few more slides in here. A couple of things, this is really going to help you. This also was done by the Brookings Institute. It measures age and happiness. I thought this was very interesting. At 18, you're pretty happy because you got like a driver's license and a boyfriend, things are going pretty well. And then you go into the workforce, and then you're the low man on the totem pole. And you have the worst hours, the worst assignments, you're getting paid less. Then you move to the right a little bit further, going out a little bit age-wise. Then you've got teenagers in the house, which is terrific. Then you begin to take care of elderly parents, which is an important part of your life, but very challenging. And then about the age I'm at, I'm 63, things get a lot better. You get a lot happier. So today's message is don't die. Don't die, because it's going to get much better, much happier. New and improved, you always hear people talking about nostalgic, oh, it was better back then. It wasn't. Things are getting better for most of us. Babies born today, the luckiest crop in history, Warren Buffett said. The average American today has access to better transportation, entertainment, communications, and medical services than the robber barons did in the 1930s. It is getting better. People tell me it's not going to get better. I always put this slide up, and that is one word to explain things are getting better: dentistry. So the shift, and this shift, basically more and more of us are working with our minds, and fewer of us are working with our hands, and job workforce has got to line up to that. Education and wages, basically if you had a college education, at least an undergraduate degree, you've been doing very well, keeping up with the economy, maybe outdoing the economy. But if you had less than that, you've really been stumbling in this economy. And that is, those are the people we've got to bring up. GDP projections, and I think this kind of tells a story in here. Bank of America thinks that 2021, you'll have a 6% GDP growth. Once again, these are temporary. You're going to go right back where you were at some point. And they think in 2022, it would be 4.5%. And look at what Goldman Sachs is saying. And the bottom line is it's the same thing. Goldman Sachs is saying 7% growth in 2021 and back to the normal 2.4% in 22. What this is saying, it's not so much the numbers, is that Bank of America thinks a lot that when the recovery comes, much of it will be in the third quarter, but much more of it might be in the beginning of 2022, whereas Goldman is saying the bulk of the recovery, the bulk of the economic boom is going to be in 2021 in the back half, and it'll really slow down back to where we were before in 2022. It'd be interesting to see which one's right. Why do we like small cap stocks? We think that's where the growth is. We mentioned Hoppy's company, a tremendously well-run bank there in Hattiesburg. They have faster growth. The management owns a lot of the stock. They're more flexible. They're more likely to be bought out. We have a mutual fund, the Birkenroad Fund. It's HHBUX. It's public company. It's public fund. It's been open 20 years and it's outperformed 83% of the nation's mutual funds, which says a lot about the companies in our region. But we've had 50 companies bought out since we started. So it kind of tells you where that's going. Generally more domestic, so you don't deal with all the tariff issues and all. And catalysts, they're small enough for a change to really move the needle for the company. These are readings. I know you'll have these, so I won't go over them, but these are the readings we do in class, either all or part of these books, and I think you'll really enjoy them. The first book there is One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. He was the great money manager at the Fidelity Magellan Fund. Small book, you could read under a tree in a day in layman's language. If you had a young person and you wanted to tell them how the markets went, it's definitely the book they should start with. But he talks about how he finds some of the great stocks that did so well. And he talks about one trip is he went to go see the management of Holiday Inn in Memphis. And he asked them, he'd owned some stock in Holiday Inn, and he asked them, do you have any tough competitors? Anything bother you? And finally they shook their heads and they go, yeah, there's this company in Texas called La Quinta, and they are kicking our butt. And so he, instead of buying Holiday Inn, he went back to Boston and bought stock in La Quinta, and it went up 20-fold. So you can find out a lot just by asking competitors. Don't short the U.S. If anybody's bet against the U.S. since 1776 is lost, and they will continue to lose. So we've got a difficult time here. We've got a lot of fighting. We're on both sides. It's a pendulum, though. It's always a pendulum. We get too conservative. We get too liberal. Swings back. The bottom line is we're sane people in this country, and it will be all right if we can just hold our heads together here. Think about it. People tell me capitalism is a deck of cards, house of cards or something like that. It's not. Democracy and capitalism are the only systems that work in the world. And as long as people have babies, capital depreciates, technology evolves, and tastes and preferences change, there's a powerful underlying impetus for growth that is almost certain to reveal itself in any reasonably well-managed economy. And that's the truth about the economy. Is capitalism cyclical? Yeah. It goes up, heats up, needs to get cooled down, goes right back up and reaches to a higher plateau. Finally, these are the books. I wrote a book called Stocks Under Rocks, which is about it was 20 years of going out and visiting companies with these students and all the things we learned. The radio show, if you want, all those shows are archived and at itsneworleans.com, so you can listen to any of them. We've had 500 guests over that time. And then Birkenroad reports, you can see the reports that the students have written at birkenroad.org. So I just wanted to thank you so much for having me, and Hoppy for inviting me. And I learned an awful lot from Paul. I tell you, I'm going to be once I can go to a cocktail party, I will have more things to say at a cocktail party. So thank you very much for having me this morning.
Peter, gosh, thanks so much. I apologize. We have a commonly occurring problem at this company. Our IT folks are very familiar with it. There's a dead short between my seat and my keyboard. And so I was unable to get unmuted and get you introduced properly. But thanks so much for that presentation. And Paul,
Thank you.
Thanks again. So Dean Beckton, I'll turn that over to you, sir, for closing remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul and Peter, for those insightful presentations. I know that we've had a couple of questions come in, and there may be some more that come in as we move into the Q&A section. So I'll read the questions. If the participant directed it at one of the presenters, I will let you know that this is which one it's for, or if it's for either or both of you. So first question we have is for Paul. And the question is, as a university, some female students have expressed concern about taking a vaccine because they're in their childbearing years. Are there any guidelines or statistics about this concern that you're aware of?
Sure. So that's something. Sure, that's something we hear a lot. So one thing I would say during the Pfizer vaccine trial, pregnancy rates were unchanged between those that were vaccinated and unvaccinated. And unfortunately, there were miscarriages, but actually all the miscarriages occurred in the placebo group. Additionally, the J&J vaccine, they did toxicity studies on rabbits on reproductive capabilities, and those all came back negative. So, we're not seeing, in terms of the rates, you can look at the trials, you can look at the pregnancy issues, and have not seen any impacts to that, as well as, the vaccines now have been out, and been given shots since December. We're now 4 months into it. We're not seeing any reports of any differentials between pregnancy. So I would not hesitate for anyone who's of childbearing age to take the vaccine. And frankly, would recommend those that are pregnant to have the vaccine because you pass that protection on to your unborn child.
Thank you. The next question is for either speaker. What effect has COVID had on women in the workforce? Peter mentioned women being more educated typically, but I've read reports regarding a decrease of women in the workforce during the pandemic due to COVID.
I think it's a good one for Peter.
Peter, you're still muted.
I haven't heard anything like that. I really, I think the one thing, I guess that I was thinking of it in terms of physically, but the one thing that probably has pushed those numbers is that people now have to work from home, and they're taking care of in many cases, it's the wife that has the biggest responsibility for the children, which shouldn't be, but it is. And so I think that's maybe too much, and it would definitely be too much for me. So I think some people have left the workforce, some women, to take care of their children. I expect them to be right back there again, though. So I can see it. If it is, it's a temporary thing, Brett.
Yeah. So that's more of a temporary situation that should rectify itself. The next question is for Paul. Could you please describe your vision or interpretation of what the next normal will be beginning late third quarter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it's going to take some time for people to recognize the vaccines are very protective. And so I think there's the hardest part that I struggle with is, when we have a hybrid environment with people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. I think you're going to see a lot of people start to internalize the fact that they've got the vaccine, that they're protected. And I think people are going to go out and do a lot more things that are vaccinated. So I think you're going to see more people traveling. I think you're going to see more people gathering together. I think you're going to see a rise in people doing restaurants and other activities. But I also think there's going to be a chasm between the haves and the have-nots, those that are vaccinated and unvaccinated. And eventually that will probably come up and be solved, as the virus transmits to more of those folks. So it's really hard to say what it's going to look like. It's going to be, public health is normally cautious, and how quickly that they start, the CDC is going to issue their guidance coming out in the next, couple days in terms of how to act when you're vaccinated. And they're still being very restrictive. I think at some point people are going to ignore them and just going to kind of do their own thing once they start to internalize how well these vaccines actually work, quite honestly.
Thank you. I have a question for Peter. Could you share your thoughts on modern monetary theory?
Well, I think the general idea there is that debt doesn't count. I think that is the feeling. I understand the argument, but I guess I'm just too old. I know that debt does count because eventually you start to squeeze out the private borrowers, and because the government's just sort of eating up all that capital that's going into treasury. So I don't agree with them. I just don't think that it's right.
Okay. This question is for either speaker. What effect has COVID had I've already read that one. It's come in a second time. Okay, Peter, this one's for you again as well. What are your thoughts on regionalism as the future for economic development?
I think that could be, particularly for states like ours. I think that's going to be the key. It's breaking down. You can even see within your own state. A lot of people, whether it's a parish or a county, are so myopic in economic development that it has to be in my region and such. And the bottom line is we've got to work together. We've got to stop clobbering each other on these kind of deals. And it's, you can see in some places it's really worked. Like you take Tampa St. Pete. They basically created themselves where they're now one place. You look at Minneapolis, St. Paul. Those kind of folks have done the right thing. And because you just can't do it the way it is now. The way it's being done now is we're basically competing against other states, and we're sort of giving away the farm in terms of taxes, and we're competing on low wages. The more we can form a block, the more that we can get over that, we're going to be able to attract more and more very good, very high-paying jobs. So people are going to have to kind of bury the hatchet a little bit, and even if it goes across state lines, it's it's the right thing to do, and hopefully people can get the courage to do it.
Thank you. Another question for you. If you are giving advice to a student about the direction of their education, maybe it's someone that's entering as a freshman, what would you suggest as their top 3 to 5 majors based on your projections?
Oh, I think anything with computer science you're just gonna blow the doors off. So that basically what I'm going by is how does the job market look for these students? So that is one. Healthcare isn't going to go away. That's just going to increase. I think in the investment side, the business side, finance is going to do terrific, and accounting, they cannot find enough accountants. It is they get, every one of our students gets 3 or 4 offers in accounting, and that's not true for the rest of the school or anything like that. So I think that's where I would go. And the interesting thing, this is the non-college part, but I really think people might want to consider is getting a trade and running a business and trade. You can't find people to do these jobs well. And, my wife and I always laugh that if we find like a plumber that shows up and does a good job, we're very kind people, but we won't give the name to our neighbors and friends because we want this. So, yeah.
Just keep them on retainer.
Yeah.
Well, this next question is for either. Do you think we'll see the work from home trend continue after the pandemic?
Yeah.
So I can take a crack at that one, at least, from the financial side. I think that for banks, there's some challenges. There are some jobs, obviously, in the retail environment that have to be done on site. For back office environment, though, we're seeing a lot of investment in the infrastructure for this to be long-term. And we're seeing a lot of investment for this for offices in general. So we do a joint trades call with a lot of the big financial trades. And they're moving towards, it's interesting, people talk about remote work and having core days on site. They're actually having core remote days. Because if you ever try to do a hybrid environment where you have half virtual, half remote, it's actually hard to hold meetings, things like that. They're actually planning on core remote days. ABA itself is moving to allow 3 days a week remote. And so, we just, are out doing a new lease and we reduced our space because of that. So I think, commercial real estate impact is going to be really big to measure on where that goes. But I do think it's here for the long term. I just don't see it going back. And you can even look at the job postings. They're all saying remote work all the time. I think it's going to be something that people expect as an option for those positions that can do it.
I completely agree with Paul. That he's absolutely nailed it. I just don't see you getting the genie back in the bottle on this one. It's I think 5 years ago when somebody was working from home, you basically thought they were goofing off. That's the way I always thought, mainly because I was goofing off. But it's now you're getting more done at home. We had somebody on the show that owned a couple of office buildings in downtown New Orleans, and they really don't know what to do next. And the interesting thing about those office buildings is that guy that owned a po' boy shop downtown. You think, well, I don't know what that. Well, if workers are working from their home, there's less people downtown to eat a po' boy. So it's all of these things that changes have these ripple effects that I don't think we're yet even figuring out yet.
Yeah, very good point. The next question is for both speakers or either speaker. What would it look like if mid-sized companies had affordable childcare within their companies?
So I think, one of the interesting stats I saw was that 20,000 childcare facilities closed over the pandemic. And right now we haven't felt the impact of that. A lot of people are still doing virtual schooling, other things. People are working from home. I think that you're going to start seeing there's going to have to be a benefit calculation for people to go into that office. And I think that's really going to be, workers are going to be much more able to be dynamic in terms of where they work because they're not limited by geographic region now. And so if you can attract those workers that are local with those kinds of things, I think there's going to be a childcare crisis, quite honestly, that's going to come. And having that type of benefit will be a huge driver, would be my guess.
I agree. I just think in general, you're going to see better benefit packages, maybe fewer employees, but better packages. That's very important. The other thing is, everybody's talking about this $15 minimum wage. I always think of what Henry Ford said a couple of years after he'd opened the Ford plant in Dearborn. He raised the wages significantly of all the people working in the plant. And of course, all the other employers in Dearborn were furious because they were going to have to raise their wages. And they asked him why. And he said, I need my workers to have enough money to buy a Ford. And I thought, that's sort of what the story is here.
I've got the last question that has come in so far, but if anyone wants to submit one before we close out, that'd be great. But a couple of people in the audience suggested or questioned if the slides will be shared with the audience. So I know we're recording this conference, but I was wondering if Paul and Peter are willing to share those, and we could make those available.
Sure.
Okay. Yes, sir. We will handle getting that to the participants for them if you guys are willing.
Great.
So I guess last call for any questions. Let's see, something just came in. Yeah, that question's been answered already. Okay. So I guess that kind of rounds out our question and answer session. And I would like to thank Paul and Peter for their wonderful presentations. They're very informative and entertaining, and I know that it stimulated a lot of thought, and that we'll use this information for planning for the upcoming year. And we certainly appreciate your willingness to join us and share your time and expertise with us today. I also want to thank Dr. Bennett for your support of today's event. You're always gracious with your time and support of this event, and we really appreciate that. And to Hoppy Cole and the First for your continued support of this event and the College of Business and Economic Development and the University of Southern Mississippi. And finally, I'd like to thank each of you as participants for being with us today. I know it's a little different than our normal setup and format, and as we suggested, we look forward to returning to our normal format next year, and that's certainly our plan. And we just look forward to the chance to get together and network and enjoy each other's company again, as we always have. So again, I thank everybody for participating and being here today, and we look forward to seeing you again next year.